Good day. Terrance Walker with interRel Consulting Partners, here to present what's new in financial consolidations and close. First, a bit about interRel Consulting Partners. We have been lauded a number of times by Oracle, having won the most recent Oracle Partner of the Year Award in 2019. We have a number of recognized experts, given that we have 6 Oracle ACE directors or Oracle ACEs. We are a full service consulting firm, given that we have strategy and consulting practices that are primary modes of operation, along with staffing and infrastructure practices at our company as well. We also hold a number of key partnerships, including being an Oracle Cloud Excellence Partner, as well as having the most experienced resources at our firm, given that we have over 150 EPM cloud specializations, and we implement the first FCCS application. We'll jump right into today's webcast, what's new in financial consolidation and close. Speaking of financial consolidation and close, it is Oracle's purpose-built SaaS solution for handling financial close and consolidations. Again, the application has been built with the best practice out-of-the-box functionality or details to meet the requirements for performing a monthly close and or consolidation processes. The application is amazingly simple to maintain. Again, the application also includes or is being run with Essbase as the background engine, which in essence gives us a form of assurance that the application will perform optimally. The application is also built with a number of pre-built definitions, including hierarchies and calculations. Again, if you're making simulations to HFM and FCC, we have advocated for how purpose-built and how effective FCC is in leveraging out-of-the-box functionalities for performing calculations that in HFM or custom calculations. So again, the myriad or litany of pre-built definitions in an application is second to none as far as being able to leverage out-of-the-box functionality features. Also, FCC has no to a very limited infrastructure investment requirement for being able to actually deploy the application or use the application on a monthly basis. So again, the cost component when it relates to FCC is much less than other like solutions. When we speak to Oracle's enterprise cloud suite, there are a number of business processes that are including the reporting layer, the planning layer of business process. But more pointedly for today's webcast, we'll speak to the financial close business process, which includes a full-featured consolidations application, also includes reconciliations, given the fact that task management and supplemental data are also included as part of the consolidation application, as well as being able to leverage advanced consolidations for those custom calculations and transaction management within our reconciliation module, and the ability to be able to produce the tax revision, leveraging the tax reporting cloud as well. So again, the Oracle EPM cloud landscape is amazingly robust, but from a consolidations perspective, there are a number of applications and our business processes that more than supersede the actual core requirement for performing the monthly consolidation and close processes. We'll next transition to some really big features that have been added to FCC that are literally game changers. This is actually probably my favorite slide that Oracle has produced recently. And again, they do a really good job of knowledge sharing and passing on information. But this is a very profile slide in that it actually speaks to how much FCC has evolved over the last few years. More specifically, the actual application achieved parity, yes, parity, with HFM in late 2018. So all of the core features and functionalities that were core components of HFM are, or better yet were, core components of FCC as of late 2018. But since late 2018, there have been so many feature and enablements in the application that we'll speak to today that literally make the competitive landscape in the consolidation space much more of a Oracle leaning than some of the misnomers that have been spread throughout the space as far as what FCC isn't or what it can't do. We'll speak to, or better yet, what it can do. We're actually displaying the actual evolution of the application over the last few years. First, we'll speak to extended dimensionality. One of the advents in the application as it extended over the last few years is the premise that we can have up to 4 custom dimensions in our FCC application. In a previous slide a few years back, that was limited to 2. But with the advent of extended dimensionality, we can extend our applications up to 4 custom DIMs. One thing to also note, if we are going to elect to enable the multi-gap feature of FCC, then we still have 4 custom dimensions, but the multi-gap feature will consume 1 of the 4. So we'd have 3 additional plus the multi-gap dimensions. So again, great ability for us to be able to compare back to HFM applications, given that most FM applications had up to 4 custom DIMs, and our reality is some of the custom DIMs in FM are now actually standard dimensions in FCC. So again, we meet the FM requirement and we exceed that by giving us the ability to leverage out-of-the-box functionality for multi-gap and other feature sets that are enablements within FCC as well. Given that, again, FSpace is the underlying engine for FCC, and that in most FCC application deployments, we're leveraging extended dimensionality. We're actually leveraging FSpace's hybrid cube, which literally leverages the best of both the block storage option and the aggregate storage option for processing from an ASO perspective, and for data evaluations or outline management, what have you, and calculations from a BSO perspective. So again, we have the best of both worlds in our hybrid cubes. And again, that hybrid cube, as we're intimated, allows us to have a much better performing application because the cube size or the database size is smaller than if we weren't leveraging the hybrid cubes. So again, we have greatly better performing calculations, what have you. We also have the ability to customize the application as much as we desire. But again, as an advisement, we always advocate for keeping it simple. And in keeping it simple, we always want to leverage the out-of-the-box feature and functionality definitions and to create customizations only when required. Now we'll transition to speaking to what's new within metadata within FCC. In one of the more recent releases or updates of FCC, there has been an update to the metadata validation process. In that prior, there was a single view to the components of metadata validations. That has since been updated to give us 3 different options or the 3 different areas of focus for our metadata validations, in that we now have the errors isolated, the warnings isolated, and any information isolated on separate tabs in our validate metadata option to be able to segregate those areas or those components as we're going through and validating metadata. Also, there's also been an addition in the validate metadata property in that there are warnings. And again, those warnings are much more indicative that parent members in the multi-gap the custom dimensions should simply be dynamically calculated members or should have the dynamic calc property assigned to those members in the, again, the multi-gap and the custom dimensions. As far as the data source dimension, again, this is an out of the box dimension of FCC. Well, conversely with an HFM, it would have been an addition. It would have been a custom dimension that we had to add. So again, as I mentioned earlier, we have the wherewithal to extend the application to 4 custom dimensions. This would not be one of those custom dimensions that would be part of the standard dimensional set. Again, the premise behind the data source dimension is, again, to leverage or to segregate data into differing components based on where we're sourcing it from. In that we can segregate general ledger data from journal entry data, what have you, and that there are specific members that are specifically focused on storing those data elements. For example, the managed data member is a member that we leverage when we're integrating data from our ETL sources, more specifically data management. The supplemental data member is indicative of data integrations from a supplemental data module, as well as the data input and the other data members are additional members in the data source dimension that we can integrate differing data sets in the application. One thing to also note is that the other data member is a feature and enablement in the application to offer an additional data element for integrating data into our data source dimension. Also, the application includes a journal input member, which again is a member that is specific to the integrations of data into an FCC application, leveraging FCC's journals module. We also have the ability to extend the components within the data source dimension, in that if we elect to enable ownership management, then there is an additional hierarchy, the source entities hierarchy, that is leveraged or works in concert, better yet, with ownership management to offer us the ability to be able to store data based on parent-child relationships based on our source entity definition. So again, we can further extend our data source dimension, leveraging out-of-the-box functionality with the ownership management enablement and that actual definition from a parent-child basis being stored or referenceable better yet from the data source dimension. We also have the wherewithal to create additional or new members in our data source dimension, in that we can now create members in our data source dimension to store data in differing currencies and or for differing purposes. For example, if necessary, we have the wherewithal to create journal entries in a differing currency other than the entity's default currency. Meaning, if I have an entity with a default currency of US dollars, I can create a new data source dimension member and assign the appropriate source data type for journals. And I can then assign the appropriate source currency type for the appropriate input currency, whether that might be Euro or British pounds, to be able to create and store journals for a US dollar primary currency entity in a Euro or British pound currency. So again, that is very, very helpful in that this is an option that we had prior that is now out of the box functionality in our application. So again, we can further extend the use case of our application to be able to record journal entries in different currencies, as well as being able to extend the data source dimension by adding additional members for tracking supplemental data, additional journal content, or just simply having additional data entry submission points or options for integrating data into our FCC application. Within our consolidation dimension, again, the consolidation dimension is synonymous with the value dimension within HFM. The consolidation dimension is a scaled down dimension that allows us to have some form of an audit trail for how data transforms during the consolidations process. Within the consolidation dimension, there are common naming conventions to the value dimension, and the pure premise is basically the same. There are just some small deviations from pure content perspective, but again, that is a ever-evolving dimension from a pure data segregation perspective. So we speak to the actual members in the actual consolidation dimension. We have an entity input member, which is our source, our primary member for integrating data into the actual application. We also have an entity total member that is an aggregation of our entity input valuations, as well as any consolidated values to a parent entity. Our proportional member is based upon the advent of having or leveraging ownership management for actually viewing data at differing views based on a translation, then a corresponding application of a percentage of ownership for a parent entity. And we also have the elimination layer, which is where our elimination activities occur based on our applications configurations for handling intercompany eliminations. And also the contribution member is simply the highest level within the initial hierarchy that actually feeds into the entity consolidation member for our parent entities for storing that consolidated value in the parent member as it rolls up to its ultimate parent. We also have the ability to extend our application via application enablement or feature enablement, in that we now, as of one of the more recent application updates, have the ability to be able to add 3 additional members, or layers, better yet, might be a better fashion of referencing it, to our consolidation dimension, in that the translated currency input member allows us to create journal entries in concert with those additional data source members in different currencies. So again, the translated currency input member is a focused member for journal entries. We also have the ability to create or submit data, better yet, at the parent level via the parent input member. And we also have the ability to be able to submit data into the contribution input member at the contribution layer of the consolidation dimension. Here's a view of the updated consolidation dimension with these particular features enabled. And that, again, as we mentioned, we have the ability to be able to integrate that any currency data into the translated currency input member via the journals module, as well as being able to enter parent currency level data via submission at the parent input layer, with the parent total being a summation of the translated local currency values into parent currency, as well as additional submissions to parent input. The same holds true at the contribution layer, in that we have the ability now to submit contribution input activities that will be post-proportion and post-elimination activities. So again, this is much more in line with the value dimension within the HFM, but it also gives us much greater flexibility within FCC to leverage out-of-the-box functionalities, as well as layering in additional journal and data submission abilities within our consolidation dimension. We also have the wherewithal to amend or update some member properties for our seated accounts, or better, seated members in the account dimension. Again, we mentioned seated members. Those seated members are those members that have a prefix of FCCS, and that we have the ability now to amend or change the account type and the consolidation operator for those seated members. But one thing to also make note, to be very mindful of, is as we're going through the process of amending or changing those member properties, we do always suggest that you run the valid metadata process to ensure that those changes are valid, or you don't run into any issues in your application. One thing to also note, if you do elect to make updates to the member properties for certain seated members, that there is now a feature in the migration options for our application, or part of the core artifact list. There is now a feature to select the module customization, which allows us to store or save these updates to these seated members, such that if we need to update the application or migrate the application's metadata for the account dimension to an additional pod or different environment, we'll be able to store those member updates for those seated members for integration. One note also is, if you're looking to simply update your account dimension across pods, simply exporting a dimension file and importing to a subsequent environment will not retain those attribute changes. That is only accomplishable via a migration of the snapshot content, in that we can simply elect to migrate or take a snapshot of the account dimension for application, and we can migrate that account dimension content across pods as a means of retaining those attribute changes for those seated members. We also now have the ability to amend or impact how we handle data that flows through the intercompany dimension via the intercompany aggregation option that is available during application creation. And that by default, we add the actual components of members or values that roll up through our intercompany entities hierarchy up to our intercompany top member. We now have the ability to amend how those data values are rolled up, and that we can elect to subtract those values, or we can elect to ignore those values as they roll up as a byproduct of the standard eliminations process. one thing to be mindful, and again, we'll expand upon this in an upcoming webcast. But again, one thing to be very mindful of is that if you're going to elect to enable either the subtraction or the ignore feature for the intercompany entities, the actual standard elimination logic still applies. But in performing these actions, there's some additional entries that are actually produced as a means of performing the subtract and the ignore and populating those data sets within your application on consolidation. But again, these are some additional options depending on the necessity to transition from adding all of our intercompany activities up to intercompany entities member with a option to now elect to subtract or ignore where desired. We'll next transition to some additional additions or some recent additions and enhancements to our consolidation applications and consolidation application rules. As many of us are aware, the actual calculation module has 6 differing rule components under 3 different categories. There are 2 insertion points at local currency. There are 2 to be able to derive or create insertion rules for translated data. And there are also 2 insertion points for advanced consolidations or elimination type calculations that will be part of the consolidated layer of the calculation manager content for FCC. We also have the ability to leverage the equity pickup in FCC. Now, one bit of personal acknowledgement. When I think back to the days where HFM was the hottest thing going, quite often I found that we created custom calculations for performing the equity pickup based on the level of ownership or the level of influence. While in HFM, there was an equity pickup, but if there was equity pickup logic in the application that we didn't always use because of, at least from my perspective, limited flexibility in being able to perform the equity calculations for equity pickup. Conversely, within FCC, that particular level of flexibility has been implemented or as part of the out-of-the-box definitions for equity pickup, in that, in large part, equity pickup is part of the advanced consolidations within FCC. It is a byproduct of ownership management, but in large part, it is a configurable definition in FCC versus a true customization that requires that you have some understanding of S-based calc scripting. So again, great win in that, one, it leverages out-of-the-box functionality, then secondarily, is a configurable definition, and then third, it does not require a great deal of depth of understanding of S-based calc scripting language to be able to derive and or calculate equity ownership or equity pickup in the FCC application. Also, part of the ownership management module, as is the case for equity pickup, there is also the advent of leveraging partner eliminations, in that we have the wherewithal now to write eliminations to differing members or other siblings of an entity versus the default or derived entity in the actual application. So again, if we need to send or to write elimination content to a different entity, we do have that wherewithal in the application. And again, I hope I'm not redundant, but I maybe need to be redundant in this case. We're leveraging out-of-the-box functionality in that we can write insertion rules in the application, given that when we enable the actual partner elimination feature functionality in the application, it then adds a 7th insertion point for the partner eliminations. But again, we do have the ability to leverage some out-of-the-box features and perform this partner elimination, as well as having the ability to be able to create some custom elimination logic to bear out the results of the partner eliminations. We also now, and this is a great win personally for me because we have a client that we're actually leveraging this functionality today. to perform calculations based on a year-to-date basis, given that by default, SBase is a periodic view application. We now have the ability to be able to source or read data for differing views of data, given that we're leveraging extended dimensionality applications as part of the enterprise license cloud EPM model. When we're speaking to leveraging our year-to-date consolidations, we're now basically speaking to being able to determine where we'll source data from for writing data into the application from a pure destination perspective. When we're speaking to the advent of the year-to-date consolidations as we're intimating, there are two different options that we have for rule sets, and that we can reference the current period year-to-date valuation, or we can simply reference the prior period year-to-date valuation as a means of deriving or calculating that year-to-date content and writing that content to the periodic view in the application. But again, ultimately, we're speaking of ultimate data valuations. We're speaking of a same end result from a closing balance perspective, but additional options for being able to define where we're sourcing data from or reading data from for calculating data on a year-to-date basis. We also have and again, this is something that we're actively using as well as a means of further improving performance of applications, is the advent of leveraging the disable to date view calculations. And again, this is another out-of-the-box feature that may be seldom used, but has been around for a while, in that feature, I believe, has been around, just not used, but when you actually elect to use it, we can further focus how data is impacted in the application. As far as computations that would have in the application, in our case, we've actually had to leverage this feature to optimize the actual consolidations of data post-integration into applications. Now, one thing to be very mindful of as we intimate, this is a very powerful feature enablement, and it really, really is. And actually is a game changer in where data actually lives, in that theoretically, when we enable this feature in our application settings, data then gets transitioned from the conventional view members, quarter date, year to date, and is then transitioned to be visible or visual in the year to date rule, half year date rule, quarter date rule, which are members in our view dimension. Again, so when we enable this feature, conventional data from a view perspective transitions from simply the quarter to date, year to date, half year date members to the secondary hierarchy within our view dimension that has a suffix of rule based on the uses of this actual calculation feature. Again, this also can be supplemented to transition data back to those conventional members by simply leveraging the update view calculations rule, which again is out-of-the-box functionality. If there is a must or there's a requirement that we leverage those year-to-date, quarter-to-date, and half-year-to-date members in the view dimension, and not simply transition down to those view-based or rule-based views in the view dimension also. So again, great win for us in that we have been able to improve performance for an application that had a really, really, really high volume of data for completing the end-to-end record-to-report integrations from differing sources into FCC for financial reporting. We also now have a new balance carry forward out of the box rule. I know I'm redundant, for being able to roll forward data to different scenarios. And that by default, the application rolls ending balances over to opening balances in the subsequent period in the application. We can also leverage the view dimension to be able to see how that data rolls or is carried forward on a year-to-date or quarter-to-date basis, given that specific logic or intellect in the application. We also now have the ability to be able to theoretically carry forward or copy data, the ending balance data from the last period of the year to the opening balance of the first period of a different scenario. So I can copy data theoretically with quotes around copy from the actual scenario to a forecast scenario to a budget scenario that actually existed within the actual FCC application. Or maybe a better example may be, let's say we had a recast scenario. I can maybe copy data from the actual scenario the recast scenario as a means of rolling and carrying that data set forward across different scenarios. So again, great win for us in leveraging this type of feature. And it also, again, just to make something very, very clear, this is indicative of a push for the first period of the year for integrating data subsequently into the application. But again, we at least have a good starting point for our opening balances as we carry those forward across scenarios. Now, this is probably my favorite rule that's been enabled over the last 3 to 4 months. I'm thinking probably that long, 3 to 4 months, in that they have literally rocked my world in that I now no longer have to create out-of-the-box calculations for defining movements. We can simply enable an option in the applications calculation manager. I can then enable a feature in the account dimension and define the appropriate members in the movement dimension for cash flows reporting purposes. And I can automatically have those values populate as if I did it via calculation and the appropriate movement dimension member for financial reporting. So again, this is a grand feature enablement that we always use in our implementations of FCC today, in that it greatly improves the actual performance of consolidations or calculations, given that we've carved out those customizations. And it really, I've seen a great improvement in consolidations and performance times, given the advent of this particular closing balance movement calculation been enabled for it. So again, great win, something I'm really excited about that has made a big change in some of our performances and applications as a means of improving or having much faster performance or much shorter consolidation times in our applications. Also, in one of the more recent application updates, and again, I know I'm redundant here, there's a lot of out-of-the-box feature and functionality definitions, and there are frequent feature enablements or feature improvements within FCC, given that Oracle is constantly looking to continue to improve this particular business process. So from that vein, they've actually improved or added some additional features for being able to leverage the copy data functionality, in that we can now include the multi-gap in our custom dimensions in our copy data functionality, in that I no longer theoretically have to create a insertion rule or on-demand rule to copy data. I can simply leverage the out-of-the-box copy data functionality. And I can even store that if I want to as a profile. So again, this just speaks to being able to extend the ability to copy data across differing points with the inclusion of some additional dimensions as a further fashion of filtering that content that is required for copying data. Also, from a calculation status perspective, we speak to copying data, we can have different options from that perspective, and that we can copy from account A to account B, or we can copy from a minute-to-minute perspective, ABCD to ABCD. So we have some options there as far as our redirections or our targets for our copying of data. And also from a pure calc stats perspective, as we're copying data across approval units, the corresponding calculation stats for those corresponding entities or approval units will be impacted and will require a reconsolidation post copying of data. Also, from a copying data perspective, we also have the wherewithal to copy journals with our application, in that we can copy journals for differing purposes to differing periods. In this particular example, is basically highlighting that we have the ability to define the entity, the data source, again, journal input, or any of the journal input data types that we define, and the corresponding account definitions and the movement dimension definitions in our copy data criteria or filtering options. And we have, again, the ability to copy that data from one source to a target. Also being very mindful that if the actual journal, our source journal better yet, is balanced and has a posted status, that journal in the target will also have a posted status as well. One thing to also be mindful of, if it's a working journal or journal that is not balanced, when I copy that data to its target, it will share that same journal status as being working based on the original status of the journal prior to copying. From a clear perspective, we also have very similar feature and functionalities that we have from a copy data perspective, and that they've added additional dimensions that we can use for further filtering how we'll clear data, and that we can now leverage the multi-gap and our custom dimensions and the clear data definitions for our further filtering of how we want to clear data from applications. As is the case for copying data, we also have the ability to clear journals from applications as well. One point of reference here, just to make sure that we're tragically clear. We're speaking to clearing journals. The reality is we aren't truly clearing journals or really clearing journals. What we really do is we're removing the effects of the journal from the application. Quite simply, we are basically unposting journals from a corresponding entity or approval unit with the ability to make an election if said journal should continue to exist. That said, we can then, from a pure definitional perspective, these are our options. Again, we can select the appropriate data source member that we want to use as our clear filter definition. Again, as an advisement, do not believe that once we elect to quote unquote clear a journal, that the journal is truly deleted, because it is not. It's simply unposted. It doesn't have a posted status. So again, there's a desire to truly clear, delete, remove the journal. We would then transition back to the journals module to delete that particular journal from our application, given that it no longer has a posted status. As I mentioned earlier, we also have the wherewithal as we're going through defining those dimensional filtering definitions for our copy and clear operations. We can actually save those definitions as profiles, and we can actually execute those profiles from the copy or clear data landing pages. We also have the wherewithal within the conduit products, APM Automate and the REST API solution, to be able to execute those corresponding profile definitions as well. So again, if I have a need to copy data or to clear data, and I'm referencing that particular process often, I have the wherewithal to save that profile, and I can then elect to quote unquote automate that profile's definition for copying or clearing, leveraging EPM Automate or REST API. This is going to probably bring smiles to faces of those folks who use HFM, in that we now have the option to create insertion rules or on-demand rules that will impact the status of entities. Now, we've always had that feature definition within HFM. We now have this feature enablement, this feature set, better yet, in FCC, given that this is an actual customization and not a configuration. We also have support for multiple functions for being able to make this definition more dynamic in the application. And we also have a number of different validations as far as where we can impact, what we can impact, and what the results are once the impact status calculation has been performed. We also, within the calculation manager, have really good functionality that helps us debug or focus our attention on some breakpoints or some areas in our on-demand rules that we can reference as optimizations or areas for improvement in our application. So again, the calculation manager now again does have a debugging feature that also leverages functions when necessary to further assist us in reviewing performance, reviewing outputs, reviewing content as a means of further improving and or optimizing the actual performance and the ultimate results of calculations that we may produce as on-demand rules. We also have the ability to be able to change the order of rules within our rule sets. Again, this is really big, and that we've actually written multiple rules that in some cases have dependencies on other rules or stored values in the application. So from this perspective, we have the ability to be able to address the ordering or the sequencing of how those rules exist or where they exist within a rule set, given the advent of there possibly being some dependencies as far as content to be a dependent valuation for a subsequent calculation as well. So again, a really good feature enablement that has been made available to us for reordering rules within our rule sets. Well, next transition is speaking to some performance improvements. And again, this is a furtherance of what I've spoken to thus far. And that, as we mentioned earlier, we have actually seen over a 75% performance improvement applications dating back to 2019 through today. And that number is consistently improving, given the number of enablements and additional features that Oracle has been providing to us on a monthly basis. We also had a really big performance improvement gain. We transitioned from having a BSO back-end S-based application to hybrid, and that leveraging of both ASO and BSO functionality was a great win for us in performance, as well as the effects or the impacts on consolidations leveraging that hybrid back-end. Also, Oracle in some of their upcoming application updates will be offering some new options for focusing how we perform our database refreshes and the effects of our database refresh processes, as well as some additional performance substitution variables that we'll be leveraging. From a database refreshing process, as we may be aware, the current, which will be the old pretty soon, database refresh process is much more of an all-encompassing view. We're going to refresh everything, even if it doesn't require any form of impact within the application based on whether it be a calculation status or what have you. The database refresh was impactful for literally everything, be it from a data perspective, be it from an ownership management perspective, even from a race perspective for the console or for the supplemental data feature functionalities. Those were all impacted using the old, we'll say, database refresh option. But if I'm not mistaken, as of the 2010 Oracle Safe Harbor, the 2010 update of FCC, we'll be able to leverage a much more focused database refresh process, and that'll be much more based on metadata and changes of the delta in metadata as a byproduct of determining what will be impacted, what shall be impacted when we're performing a database refresh. So again, if the mark ownership, there have been no changes, there have been no any additions, then there won't be that level of impact in our database refresh. So our database refresh times will be much less than we've probably experienced before when everything was taken into consideration. Also, if there were no changes to rates for any of our entities in the application from a consolidation perspective for our race cube, or even a change of race that are reflected for our supplemental data, then that particular component would be carved out from the actual actions that will be performed as a byproduct of the database refresh process. Also, when this actual feature is deployed, we'll then leverage the metadata tracking or metadata delta tracking variable. We'll turn that on, and again, this again will work in concert with the new or the revised database refreshing logic for focus database refreshes to determine what should be impacted based on those metadata delta changes that are within the application. So again, this is no more than a view of some of the logging references based on these definitions. So again, we are very excited about this. Not that the database refreshes take a super long time, but any improvements that we can have in application maintenance or administration, we welcome those with open arms. Also, as I mentioned earlier, there's some substitution variables that are defined for application performance. Here are a list of a few of these. And again, this actual definition or listing of variables actually grows or has grown. So again, as there are areas for defining some variables to further improved applications. Those have been disseminated down from Oracle on a monthly basis, or as those features are made available to us. Next, we'll transition to the journals module, and that there have been some salient updates there or enhancements, and that we have our auto reversing journal option with attachments being supported. We also have communication. Again, this is a communication enabled suite of products, and that we can receive some form of communication via email, via the journal's workflow procedure or process. We also will have the ability to send journal entries back to ERPs. Again, this may be a conversation that may have a great deal of passion, we'll say, in that some of our clients are completely averse to sending data back to ERPs without that data sourcing being done in the ERP. And others like the idea of being able to leverage the ERP and the EPM layers in concert for more enhanced financial reporting. Also within the journals module a few months ago, they enabled the ability to be able to manage true year-to-date journals, and that we can produce journals on both a year-to-date basis and on a journal-to-date basis, depending on how we want to have data impacted in the subsequent period on a year-to-date basis, or possibly in the subsequent year if we're leveraging the journal-to-date functionality in our journal-to-date, our year-to-date journal creation. We actually spoke to this earlier. We're going to expand upon it a little bit more in that, at least from a clarity perspective. I mentioned that within our application enablement, we have the wherewithal to now create a journal as a translated currency input journal, in that we can leverage the data source dimension to determine the appropriate reporting currency or input currency that we can create a journal for, which would be different than the entity's default currency. This actually just speaks to that, in that when I create a data source member that would have a source data type of journal input and a source currency type of the appropriate input currency that we want to record the journal in, I can now select that particular data source member, and by definition, because of the actual assignment and the data source properties, the currency is going to automatically populate based on that definition. So again, as I'm going through and I'm creating journals, I have the wherewithal to leverage either the default journals input member at the entity currency, or any defined data source members that will allow me to report or to record journals in differing currencies than the entity's default currency itself. Again, great win for us. Really excited about that feature enablement in the application. Next, from a process management perspective, this is probably the one that made me jump for joy, in that as of, I believe, the 2009 or maybe 2010 update of FCC, for those companies who elect to lock financial periods or the approval unit for a financial period, there was always a angst, we'll say, because if I added a new entity into my entity hierarchy, I'd have to go back to the first year, the first period of application, and lock or unlock and then lock that entity and or its parent from the beginning of time through the current period. Well, Oracle heard us. They felt our angst. So from that perspective, they've actually amended the process management functionality, in that we now no longer have to go through that procedure of going back to the beginning of time to unlock and lock that entity and or its parent. And that going forward with the advent of this new feature enablement, when a new entity is created, that entity inherits the lock status of its parent and historical periods. So we don't have to go back and manually lock or unlock those parent entities in that entity going forward. Hallelujah. Really excited about that, in that that was, in some cases, timely, depending on the number of historical years that might exist in the application. But again, we now leverage the premise of inheritancy for the locking status for those corresponding entities. Some additional information or intel relative to the actual premise of that locking and unlocking premise. And that again, if it's a shared entity and there's a lock status for the shared member, is going to retain that for the primary member. So again, if I need to make some form of update to the primary member, there will be the corresponding same impact to the shared member. Also, if there's a need to impact that primary member, submit data, what have you. If there's an impact to a member in a shared hierarchy, what have you, they would have to perform the consolidation process to have that data roll up or contribute to its parent as a byproduct of the consolidation process. Also, from a member movement perspective, if we're going to elect to move that member within the hierarchy to a different parent, we then have to perform a consolidation when necessary based on the different parent-child relationships as a means of contributing or consolidating that data up to its ultimate parent or parents. Next, we'll transition to data management. Again, we'll speak to data management. This is the cloud-based extract, transform, load, or ETL solution for integrating data into our cloud-based applications and not just FCC. Again, this application has grown by leaps and bounds over the years in that we have far greater or more improved functionality for integrating data from almost any source that you can contrive or dream of, in that the application has a multiple definitions for standard adapters directly with quotes around it for different data sources. It also has the wherewithal to be able to have some form of customization via differing scripting languages for integrating data. Also, as a byproduct or a part of the integration process, we now have within the cloud module the EPM data integration agent, which is part of data exchange, which is a comparable, if not the exact same look and feel as data management within the actual applications. And if I'm not mistaken, data exchange will be the go forward integration definitions across the EPM cloud applications. And that we have the ability with the EPM data integration agent to create a direct connection to differing ERPs or data sources. Again, in most cases, this direct connection or this integration is done via the asynchronous mode. And again, from an integration perspective, it is a win for us in our ability to directly connect to a source and define that integration on differing bases, whether it be an automated basis or being able to individually select or define what that integration's filtering or components should be inclusive of. So again, the EPM data integration agent is a feature that we've used in probably 80% of our consolidations implementations based on differing data sources from an ERP perspective and the ability to be able to directly interact with those. So again, this is something that we have greatly embraced and look forward to additional functions or feature functionalities being made available within the data integration agent. We also have the ability to drill to differing levels. And again, this is a huge differentiator between HFM and FCC in that within HFM, our drill region was based on the base level intersection of all of our dimensions. So if I had an application that had 17 custom dimensions, I had to go to the base intersection for all of those 17 custom dimensions, as well as the other dimensions. Conversely, within FCC, we still have that same drill region premise or definition, but we now have the wherewithal to drill from a parent level, which is awesome. From a pure use case perspective, it works very, very well. There are some limiters or governors as far as the number of descendant members that might be available or visible in that drill region or that drill premise. But again, I'm not limited to only drilling from a base level section. Now, I can drill from differing levels, parent level or the base level if desired. So again, really excited about this and how it actually works very well with FCC as well as the other cloud-based applications. We also have some additional modes that are made available to us within data management for performance theoretically, and that there is now a workflow mode that actually defines what or how data is treated during the actual integration, be it from the full mode, which is the default mode that brings in all the data into the tables. We have the ability to drill down those data sets and visualize that data within our workbench. Then there's also the no archive mode that again brings data in the same fashion theoretically as a full mode, but the data doesn't exist in the staging table. So again, that actually is a different premise for integrating data. In that once it's in, we clear it out. Again, that's a feature enablement that's available to us, I believe, in FDME. But from a workflow mode perspective, we don't retain that data in staging tables, though we do retain that data in the workbench. So there's a need to review data or that data content. It is available in the workbench. We also want to make sure we note that since the data does exist in the staging tables, but it does exist in the workbench, we will not have any drill down capabilities on that data because of the clearing of the staging table. So again, this isn't necessarily a performance improvement, but it does help us address space concerns, table space concerns, what have you, that we normally would have in the FDME. It does address those space concerns, given our cloud premise or cloud model for our EPM applications. And then lastly, there's a simple mode, which is just that. It does not retain data in the staging tables. It does not retain data in the workbench, and there is not an ability to drill down. But guess what? We have far better performing integrations as far as data sets, but at the sacrifice of not having drill down or being able to reference data in the workbench. So again, these are different or differing integration options that we have in data management that you can elect to explore. We just want to make sure we took a moment to speak to the effects or the impacts of leveraging either. In summary, and again, thank you guys for attending today's session. As I mentioned, this is the most profound graphic that I've seen come from Oracle in quite some time that speaks to, again, how this dang application and business process has evolved over time. I could probably speak for hours on the different feature sets and how they've personally impacted myself and my practice. But again, this is no more than a visual that speaks to what Oracle has done, and we'll, in a subsequent webcast, speak to how this looks forward and that there are multiple roadmap features and functionalities that Oracle will be deploying, and we'll make certain that we evangelize, advocate, and recommend those feature sets as they become available. With that, again, as I mentioned, thank you for attending today's What's New in Financial Consolidations and Close webcast. In our upcoming What's New series tomorrow, we actually are going to have a retail virtual conference with a number of well-known retailers who will be speaking from differing uses of the EPM applications. And then next week, same time, same bat channel, we'll have our What's New in Narrative Reporting. That will be led by my friend, Mrs. Opal Olapat, and also make certain that you're on the lookout for upcoming webcasts that we'll be announcing soon. And lastly, I want to make certain that you are aware, if you haven't been apprised, that we're very, very excited about our upcoming Hyperion Solutions Conference that will be held virtually October 19th through 22nd. And we have over 500 attendees who signed up so far, and over 75 presentations by a litany of differing partners and by some of the Oracle product management team to further speak to the merits of the Oracle Consolidation Suite and other Oracle EPM products. So again, this Solutions Conference is not, again, I don't want you to be mistaken by the name convention. This is not an on-premises conference. There will be some on-prem conversations and or sessions, but this is truly a hybrid cloud and on-prem conference that will speak to both applications. With that, I bid you a fond adieu. Thank you for attending today's session. I am Terrance Walker. Happy to lead you to today's webcast. Have a great day.